He's also the co-inventor of a patented method called culture mapping that uses computational linguistics and machine learning to analyze patterns in linguistic data in order to identify cultural trends. Say that 10 times quickly. His very topical presentation is entitled Cultural Dissociation and the Semiotics of Trump.
Thank you very much. I'm going to drop something. It's good to be here. I wish I was talking about something else. But I'm here, and I'm an American, and I'm here. I have to represent for America that we're working through some things. We talked about sickness. This is kind of where we are. Something is not right. It's a good time, though, to be an anthropologist and a semiotician. The question is, can we read the signs to know what to do about it? It's kind of interesting. I was thinking before I got up here is that, this really relates to McLuhan because it has so much to do with the intrinsic nature of human beings, which we are tool builders. We build tools, and our essential conflict is with those tools. So essentially, are the tools making us, or are we making the tools? And, it's interesting. There's somebody who writes for the New York Times who's actually rediscovering the Luddites. And maybe they had a point. And it's at points like this where you start looking back and saying, are we really being shaped by our technology, or are we truly using our creative imagination in the best way we can? We have to use our semiotics and our cultural sort of lens to be able to understand kind of what's going wrong. It's a bit of a disembodiment. It's a cultural dissociation. There is a sense that we try to catch up to where the technology is, and in some ways we basically give in to what the technology is and allow it to sort of shape what is language, discourse, and culture. And that's kind of where we are. We're in this sort of state of kind of misfiring between identity. The other important part to look at is when we think about looking at Trump, when we think about looking at it from this lens, is that it isn't about Trump. It really is, more importantly, to be looking at it much more largely as how we understand national identity. We need to be looking at it kind of as a design problem and not simply about the other. It is really about us. Trump is us. Brexit, if you're in the UK, is you. And we must claim these things to be able to do something about them. It has a lot to do with a process that we're going through. It goes back to those Luddites. It's that this loss. We're essentially kind of not understanding the world we're in. We don't quite know if you teach in a university, every university now is trying to figure out how they prepare their students for a world that they don't know they completely understand anymore. I teach those students and they wonder, well, what will I do? Well, the university is having a harder time keeping up with that. So we kind of fall back on easier answers. That's really kind of where we are. And we get to Trump, which is, he has small hands, but he has big thumbs. McLuhan, has that lovely quote, man becomes the sex organs of machines, essentially, and, could they have ever imagined Donald Trump? He embodies this automatic use of language, and language that has more to do with the intrinsic grammar of the technology than it has to do truly with human beings, and especially has little to do with policy and politics and good government and healthy societies. So, and we see it playing out in terms of memes. Memes are kind of how this multiplies. Technology is good at multiplying messages. we don't engage these messages deeply. We skim along the surface, and they're designed, their grammar is so they're shareable. We don't reflect over them, we share them. So that creates a sickness. You know, that lack of reflection is where our current disease is. As, you know, as semioticians, I would say we're kind of the epidemiologists of culture. You know, our job is to kind of look at language and expression and say, what's going on here? How do we not succumb to the worst that is there? How do we sort of regain that control back in terms to how things are working? I would like, if you're not already familiar, with Buckminster Fuller may not have gotten along with McLuhan, but there's a lot of great synergies between the two. And the concept of livingry versus weaponry. And I think in terms of how language is being used in the world of technology, we have weaponized language. You hear it now. I mean, it's over the last year, if you track these things, it's like in the media, weaponized language, it's weaponized. Everything has become weaponized in that way. Is that it has more to do, when we say that, what we're saying is it's designed more for what that does, as opposed to as that extension, what Marcel was talking about. It's an augmentation of our creative imagination. That's truly what technology should be, but we haven't quite figured that out. So we need to sort of really look for a more living approach to using language. It comes to thinking about how good societies function, you know, the concept of res publica, the public thing. There's many different interpretations of that. But, you know, for there to be a public thing, there has to be a healthy relationship between the individual and the community that becomes the state. And sort of, you know, it's the relationship between policy and activism. It's the relationship between rights and laws. There's a cyclical nature to this. There's patterns of dissent and aspiration. It's a system that is working, and when it works well, it has to do with that participatory nature. Technology is actually kind of throwing this off and creating kind of an artificial kind of way in which information is being shared and sort of causing this system to kind of break down in many ways. We use a method called culture mapping, which is essentially a semiotic square, but it's a way of structuring language to be able to measure it. We use this in relation to data science, algorithms, and computational linguistics to measure language as it migrates by different clusters and be able to develop taxonomy. So we look at two key patterns within this matrix are that pattern of dissent, which is the beginning of symbolic meaning, again, in reaction to what has become overly saturated within culture. Something's not working. There's a response to that. And similarly, you know, you have that pattern of aspiration from ritual to identity. You don't have healthy cultures unless people are actually physically involved. You can't phone it in. You have to have people engaged in the ritual at some level. It can't simply be virtual. There has to be some way in which technique is involved, language ties to technique, behavior, it's shared. That's very important. The sort of the history of oral storytelling tells us that in terms of like how we understand stories has much more to do with how they're received than how they're told. And that is really that kind of relationship between technique and ritual in context. So we use this particular method. We analyzed last 2 years of Donald Trump's tweets, so you don't have to. And put it into we put the first 100 days online, into an online version. And the important part is to be able to kind of code this language to start seeing kind of patterns. Because it's Trump you're looking at, but Trump is part of the semiosis, and it's related to what are these other kinds of connections of language that we need to be able to see. By visualizing it that way, just as Buckminster Fuller was saying, is that we need to be able to see to create that new literacy. By visualizing these relationships, we can encourage a greater literacy. And so, 100 days, we looked at real Donald Trump and POTUS. There's kind of interesting the relationship between those two. 858 tweets, 19,314 words. And we go through a process of analysis of finding what are key signifiers. And so we put those to the machine to be able to kind of find these different patterns. So, you start seeing these kind of relationships emerging to particular subject areas, and you start seeing how archetypes start emerging and what the weighting of those archetypes. The weighting for Trump is really within the protester and within the publicist, which is very sort of dangerous in a lot of ways. You get taxonomies emerging around subject areas, and you start seeing emotional kinds of use of language. Where's the high volatility? Where are the flat lines? It's very much within his use of language around the protester archetype and the publicist. And so what you get there is really kind of a dangerous cocktail of hyperbolic outrage and promotion is really what it is. It's kind of this staying within kind of a state of cognitive dissonance that is, he's constantly there to sort of resolve but keep you sort of uncomfortable. He does it also in his rallies. We study his rallies as well. NYU did an interesting study saying that moral, emotional words are more likely to go viral on social media. I mean, it's essentially the more sort of ideologically charged that we make language, the wider it spreads, which can create echo chambers. You have Make America Great Again is essential political semiotics. It's not the words, it is how the words are received and connected to other concepts. And I would say the wall is the perfect narrative for that because it's something that nobody knows and cares that's going to be built. It's this sort of mythology, but it brings to mind in many people like a dog whistle towards other things that they hear within that language. And we recognize it within particular uses of words, the uses around these subject areas. Beware of the rise of technology-induced extreme rituals. We all love the Ice Bucket Challenge. It did great things for the ALS, but we have to think in terms of similarly fake ritual that can create kind of an artificial state of civic engagement. This is Trump with his signing. He believes he's actually signed a lot of laws into, and a lot of, if you talk and poll his Trump followers, they believe that too, because it looks as though it's happening, right? There's a lot of the disembodied meaning that's happening within his discourse. We have basically a primer for an artificial state, and we have to understand how this can, the only way to sort of come back in an understanding is to gain a literacy for what is actually happening so we can regain control of the language. It's a seriously great time for semiotics. And it is a really good time for literacy. I really believe literacy is the key to freedom. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I'm really blown away by how all of these papers are dovetailing so neatly into each other, and they're all picking up on themes. So it's great. We're just going to open the floor to questions again.
I got a question about the language or the nature of language used by Trump and populists in general. Don't you think that the language became like more bodily? I mean, even when he's talking with his thumbs, or it's also represented in this "Make America Great Again." The "make" thing, or action, or performance, is actually a very important aspect of his language. And on the other hand, we got this language which is more a domain of thought or of mind, and it's actually kind of an opposition that forms in here, and that the crisis, I'll call it a crisis, is actually, for me, is maybe a result of still not knowing how to use your language through your body. I mean, I don't know if you know what I mean, because there's this conflict between mind and body, or speaking through mind and body. It seems to be very important now, and yeah, I'm just wondering if we should like go back to the mind, or try to understand how to speak with your body and performance.
It's very important that we see them together, and one of the things that's very particular to Trump is that, yes, he does use a lot of, I would call it hyperbole. And you can see the hyperbole in gesture also in, if you do computational sort of analysis of all his use of words, how many are in caps? And then also how many are followed by emojis? And it's this sort of, and periods. He loves, it's like this. However, that is not necessarily good gesture, good discourse is more synchronous with the body, the public body. If you do discourse analysis between, say, Instagram, selfies, and the political leader of a particular country, you get a very interesting insight into the dimensions, cultural dimensions of that country. If you look at, say, Russia, Putin, also very, and you see the selfies, how they sort of begin to sort of move away. There's almost sort of a creation of language, understanding their context to subvert that language. Language and protest and politics are so intertwined, and so our use of language is always to sort of say, I'm here, I'm kind of, and so if all it is to repeat, which I think Trump does, and that's what he's doing in the rallies, is what you see within, you saw with, go back to the 1930s and study Hitler, Mussolini. It's about creating gesture that I can repeat. We don't want that. We want narrative to continue. It goes back to the tradition of oral storytelling. You don't tell a story to have it repeated. You tell a story so then the listener receives that, adds something, they can edit, it becomes something, it integrates into the behavior ritual of that particular village. They use that information. That's very important. He's kind of essentially instigating. That's what the gesture is mostly about, and it's instigating that cognitive dissonance that I was mentioning, which is, I'm scared. Yes, you should be scared, and that's not a healthy environment to be in. It's a kind of